begins when something goes wrong. A lawsuit, a contract dispute, a regulator, maybe a bank freeze. But liability almost never begins there. It begins much earlier. It begins when structure and behavior stop matching. Tonight is not about how to build anything. There are not going to be any steps, no checklist. This is about something where you recognize that liability actually starts long before most people think it does. Because by the time that an institution is involved, they're not asking what you intended. They're examining what your structure proved. If you just joined, we're examining where liability actually begins. Why documentation alone does not create separation, and how authority patterns override entity intent, and what fails first when the structure is tested. This is about recognition, not instruction. Liability rarely begins at the moment of conflict. It begins at the moment that structure stops being real in practice. Not legally, behaviorally. Most owners think that liability begins when a contract is breached, a lawsuit is filed, a loan is defaulted. But in reality, liability usually begins when the authority is unclear. Money moves without structure. Personal behavior overrides entity behavior. Institutions see continuity between the owner and the entity. And by the time the conflict appears, the pattern already exists. The conflict only exposes it. If you just joined, we're looking at where liability begins in behavior, not paperwork, and why institutions examine patterns long before the conflict appears. Here's something to think about. Documents record structure. Contrary to popular belief, documents do not create structure. Separation only exists when the authority is consistent, the money flows match the structure, the decisions follow entity hierarchy, and the institutions can observe independence. In reality, you can have perfect documents and still have zero separation because institutions don't evaluate intent. They evaluate evidence. And again, contrary to popular belief, evidence is always behavioral, not paperwork. If you just joined, documentation can exist without separation. Institutions Evaluate behavior patterns, not filing events. Filing is not a decision. And in most instances, every instance, the intent is going to be invisible. It's the authority that's observable. And if authority flows through one person across multiple entities without structural friction, the institutions are going to treat that system as one risk body, even if legally it's not. The authority patterns show up through who signs, who decides, who moves money, and who can override the process. If the authority collapses into a single behavioral channel, then the entity separation weakens regardless of the paperwork. If you just joined, the authority patterns often determine risk exposure more than entity paperwork. That's almost the moral of the story tonight. The authority patterns often determine risk exposure more than entity paperwork. Structure almost never fails all at once. It fails in layers. And the most common first failure points: bank recognition, contract enforcement, insurance interpretation, tax authority classification is another, creditor tracing of control and benefit. Creditors tracing control and benefit. And institutions, they always test structure under pressure. And those are some of the pressure points. And the stress doesn't create the structural weakness. It simply reveals it. We are examining where liability actually begins, why documentation alone doesn't create separation, and how authority patterns can actually override entity intent. And finally, what usually fails first when the structure is tested. Most structural failure is going to be silent. It exists long before the conflict, long before the pressure shows. The goal is not to predict the failure. The goal is to recognize exposure early enough that structure can exist before it's examined. That's the goal for the ongoing business. It is to recognize exposure early enough that structure can exist before it's examined. And the reason is because institutions, they don't decide what structure is. They reveal what structure already was. Thank you for joining us tonight on the Pro Sapreneur Network.